sweet introduction and for reminding me of my old definition of diplomacy. There's another definition by Will Rogers that I was always fond of, which is diplomacy is the art of telling the other guy to go to hell in a way that makes him look forward to the trip. And I'll try to make you all look forward to this trip because I honestly appreciate the chance to address the council on the prospects for President Biden's China policy. I follow the council's work very closely, do some great things. And personally, I've had a lot more contact with business leaders since I left government. And it's become very clear to me that the insights that executives and entrepreneurs collect through practical experience doing business in China and with China is a vastly underutilized resource for US policymakers and analysts and so on. Because my background is foreign policy. It really isn't business or economics or trade, or for that matter, fortune telling. So I want to lower the bar at the very outset when it comes to predictions, which, as Yogi Berra, another great quote, famously pointed out, are particularly hard when they're about the future. But that said, there really is a lot that we already know, and there's more that's sort of hiding in plain sight by way of clues about the shape and the trajectory of China policy under the Biden administration. And some of the evidence can be found just in the things that Biden and his nominees have been saying in public statements or in testimony. Some of it can be seen in the things that they've done or the things that they've chosen not to do in the first 2 weeks they've been in office. You see the calls that Biden and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and General Austin have made have been almost exclusively to allies. Certainly not to Xi Jinping or to Wang Yi or to Liu He. And beyond that, the avalanche of executive orders that President Biden has signed already have dealt mostly with domestic issues. None of them have, as far as I know, have had to do with trade. And he's made clear that he's not rushing to tackle, new trade negotiations. There are other things that I think are common wisdom or common sense. That the Biden team is going to dial down the invective. The Biden team will take a more predictable and a less bombastic approach to China. The Biden team will try to communicate with Beijing through more effective channels than, say, Twitter, and will be more subtle and more results oriented than just bombarding Beijing with insults and giving speeches denouncing the Chinese Communist Party and calling for its overthrow and so on. So, there's a general expectation that the tone will change, but at the same time, and also, the trade craft of diplomacy and economic policy will improve, but that at the same time, the problem set itself in the US-China relationship isn't going to disappear. It's not going to fundamentally alter. And also that many of the same tools are going to be employed by the new administration as well. But admittedly, maybe with more recourse to the scalpel and less to the chainsaw or the hand grenade. I think another thing that common sense should tell us is not likely to change is the Chinese side's refusal to acknowledge that Beijing bears responsibility as well for the downturn in relations, or that China has real agency itself in improving the relationship. Former state councilor and Politburo member Yang Jiechi just gave a talk yesterday at that other China-related organization in the United States. And, it was replete with familiar conciliatory sounding bromides and slogans about, the spirit of non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect, win-win cooperation. I've practically got those formulas tattooed on my, I won't say where, after years of attending Chinese US meetings. But the basic drift was, and this is consistent with the messaging from other senior Chinese officials, the fault lies on the American side. They're not budging from the, hey, you tied the knot, you have to untie it mindset, that kind of approach. So these are some of the arguably the constants. Before we get deep into the fortune telling and prognostication, I'll take one step back and make a point based on my own experience in government, because I've been through a number of transitions in my government career, and in a couple of cases had a ringside seat. So I joined the Obama National Security Council January 21, 2009, literally day one, the first full day of the Obama era. And I stayed on as Assistant Secretary of State for the first few months of the Trump administration. So through not only the transition, the inauguration, but the launch of their China policy. And I mean, I can testify to the fact that every new administration, and this, probably since Eisenhower, at the outset is adamant about correcting the idiotic way that its predecessor dealt with China. Every new administration comes in vowing to break all the bad patterns and this time do it right and get better results. And look, that is undeniably the case for the Biden team. But there are a number of aspects of the current situation that I think are decidedly unique and that are going to impact the Biden administration's effort in a variety of ways. I mean, the most obvious one is the fact that the world and the United States are in the midst of a catastrophic health crisis, the pandemic, and are grappling with the economic fallout from that. I mean, that's huge. But there are four other factors that strike me as important in the equation of how US-China relations are going to play out, quite apart from policy choices. One is that Biden himself and virtually every member of his national security team and much of his economic team come into office with very extensive experience dealing with China. And Craig, I'm sure you'll agree that is very important. Now, it does not mean that they are guaranteed success by a long shot, but it does mean that they've already made most of the mistakes that everybody makes when you begin dealing with China. And I think it means that as a result, they're going to approach this challenge with a bit more savvy, a bit more humility, a bit more resolve, frankly, than the first time around. So that's one thing. Second is that there has been such a significant transformation in the atmosphere and the attitude in the United States towards China among political elites, is particularly true in Congress, in the business community, among national security professionals, academics, the general public, so on. And so, some of the premises and guiding principles that administrations have routinely operated under in dealing with China, engagement, cooperation, compromise, interdependence, mutual benefit. These are not givens by a long shot. In fact, they may not be operative now. There's also, thirdly, a transformation on the Chinese side, which I've lived through, and it's very significant. Right now, my take is that in Beijing, particularly in policy circles, but I think more broadly among the Chinese public, there is a very strong wellspring of anger towards the United States, of suspicion, the conviction that the United States really means to harm China. And that's mixed in many quarters in China with a fair degree of contempt for the United States, a sense that the United States is in terminal decline, and that these anti-China moves, particularly in the waning days of the last administration, are sort of emblematic of the final throes of a failing empire. There's also the transformation in China, engineered under Xi Jinping, towards a more ideological, a more politically conformist society, a huge intensification of party control, walking away from what we traditionally had thought they meant by opening and reform. Championing state-owned enterprises, tightening control over the private sector, and externally, of course, leveraging market access as both a carrot and a stick, and punishing these upstart miscreant countries like Australia, or organizations, like the NBA and whatever. And more broadly, pursuing a vastly more activist and more competitive set of global policies, global behaviors. So, all of the council members who have long experience with China know, this is not your grandpa's China we're dealing with today. And for the fourth factor that I see is not China specific, but it's a shift in the broader Asia Pacific region towards hedging. A greater skepticism about the United States, maybe a greater degree of suspicion towards China. You see this in all of the polling, that negative attitudes towards China have dramatically intensified in the region, in no small measure because of bullying and missteps by Beijing. But you also see the polling show a catastrophic drop in confidence in the United States. And that the experience that many of these countries in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific have had with Washington over the past few years are going to make it really an uphill battle for the Biden administration to mend fences and to win back trust and confidence of partners who have seen norms and treaties shredded, who've been sanctioned and denounced as freeloaders, watched often in horror as American politics and American societies seem to be going haywire. So these are some of the factors that I think set the stage. But now, the question is, what do we know, or what do we think we know about the Biden team's approach to China? And so I've got a list that I'll run through, and I'll be interested in what you and your members think. So, number one, I think the key is that the Biden team wants to be smart about China policy. They want to be methodical, coherent. They want to be integrated in their approach. They want to think things through before launching, ready, aim, fire, get the sequence right. And that's manifest in the decision to conduct a very careful and comprehensive review of the China-related measures that they've inherited, including tariffs, as well as China policy more broadly. And related to that, secondly, I'd say that it's pretty clear that the Obama people are not going to be rushed, that they are determined to do this right. I don't mean that they're slow walking engagement with China, but that they are trying to approach the Chinese in a deliberate sequence and in a measured way. Jen Psaki, the White House spokesman, used the phrase strategic patience, which has a lot of baggage and some unfortunate connotations, but you get the idea. Like, don't rush, don't act on reflex, make sure you know where you're going to land before you jump out of the plane, kind of stuff. I think third is the very well documented determination to concentrate on domestic recovery and renewal. But I think this too bears some clarification, because it doesn't mean that they're so consumed with domestic issues that they're not going to have the bandwidth to deal with foreign policy. Rather, they've stressed at every level that foreign policy and domestic policy have to be seen as complementary, as mutually reinforcing. They're connected. So, it's not an accident that the new head of White House domestic policy is a former national security advisor, Susan Rice, or that the current national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, spent much of the last 4 years working on domestic policy issues. I think it also means, and I know this from my own experience, that Biden himself understands that when you're dealing with a system like the Chinese Communist Party system, which is essentially a Leninist authoritarian outfit, that it's critically important that you appear to them to be operating from a position of strength. And by strength, I don't mean chest thumping rhetoric and threats. And it also doesn't mean that every problem has to be solved. It means that, on our side, we can have problems, but we have to show resilience. Demonstrate that the U.S. is getting back on track, getting its act together. That yet again, this amazing American capacity to bounce back after a period of turbulence or disarray or invading other countries, that we retain that resilience. And so as I think that the focus on domestic renewal and strengthening, revitalizing the United States means for you all, for council members, in practical terms, that this is likely to be an administration that is seriously inclined to actually listen to US business, to seek advice and insights. I'm not saying they're going to oblige you across the board, but to hear, because of the administration's interest in trying to ensure that US business can successfully compete. So it's not just going to be like the My Pillow guy and Sheldon Adelson whose voice is heard going forward. And then fourth, I would say that I expect them to, it's clear that they are putting a priority on consulting, not just with domestic stakeholders, but with allies, making common cause with overseas partners. And here too, this is not to be confused with arm twisting. It's consultation, it's inclusivity. Jake Sullivan said he's after, he wants to form a chorus, right? So not, not just a posse. Now, it's obviously sensible, I think, because working with and through allies and mobilizing a multinational cohort has been an incredible force multiplier for the United States already in the past. Now, it's hard in the best of times, and these are not the best of times, and keeping people together is even harder. China is a huge growth market for everybody, and if the Biden administration is doubling down on Buy America provisions, well, that complicates life. But I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that it's both a priority and really a prerequisite to being able to deal effectively with problematic Chinese behavior. Fifth on my list of kind of attributes of the Biden team approach, I think, is clearly taking a values-based, a rules-based approach to foreign policy, meaning that they intend to actively champion democratic governance. They intend to be active in multilateralism and rule setting and so on, and to contest the so-called China model, the techno-authoritarianism, which is what Tony Blinken named it. And that doesn't mean just denouncing China from the rooftops for human rights offenses, for violating international rules. It also means looking for ways to impose costs, things that actually have an impact, to push for accountability. But the goal of that isn't to punish, it's to discourage or to deter the problematic behavior. And part of that strategy is going to have to be reasserting a US role in regional organizations and international institutions, including the rule setting and the standard setting forums that can have a huge impact on the global business environment that each of you operate in. And the last feature, the Biden approach that I'd mentioned, is their declared determination to compete hard in technology, or more accurately, to outcompete China and to secure America's historic edge in technology platform innovation. Jen Psaki said from the podium early on, technology is at the center of US-China competition. And some of it clearly is defensive. Bob Gates's so-called small yard, high fence approach, figuring out how you can sequester only the technology that's really germane and essential to our national security, and not conduct a sort of wider decoupling that knocks major companies out of the global supply chain. But I think that their priority also isn't just defensive, it's offensive, or maybe offensive is the wrong word, but proactive, upping our game. And look, Biden's made clear that this is going to require dramatic capacity building in the United States, R&D investment, infrastructure, education, private sector, government, academic partnerships, the old model. Now, people talk about this being a Sputnik moment, but, in the Sputnik era, the last time government, private sector, and academia really pulled together, military innovation was the generator of commercial technology. Today, it's kind of reversed, and it's the commercial technologies that have revolutionary military applications and national security implications. So it's a very different world, and the government needs new skill sets, needs to approach these things differently. So I don't want to go on too long. But as Biden sorts through the debris of the US-China relationship that he's inherited, he's got to decide what he's going to do about trade tariffs, right? The tariffs may not work well. They may have huge costs to us as well as to the other side, but they're leverage, and leverage is a precious resource, and you don't give it away. So I wouldn't expect he's going to be in any hurry to unwind them. And in any case, to reduce the tariffs is negotiations, right? It requires horse trading. The administration needs time to get people in place. They need to sort of think through their objectives and tactics first. They need to consult and sync up with like-minded partners first. They need to get into a position of strength to negotiate from. So I don't think this is a tomorrow thing. And probably something similar applies to the phase one deal. And the council's report makes very clear how far short the deal fell from the goals that Trump set when he launched the trade war, all the things it didn't do. But I don't see an upside to the Biden administration and walking away from it. They've also got a big inheritance in the range of export controls and investment screening procedures, prohibitions, rules, lists, licensing requirements, and so on. And some of those are driven by legislation. Congress has been like super active on China policy in the last 4 years. Some of them came together in the dying days of the last administration and may have been meant just to box Biden in. A really astonishing number of these measures have just not been implemented. They fell off the screen, or think TikTok, or they're tied up in litigation, and some are really unenforceable or are punitive measures that are not effective and more like vengeance than corrective actions. So it does make sense that the Biden team is going to conduct a thorough review of the tangle of provisions and analyze sort of the cost benefit ratio, try to bore down on the question of what they're really trying to achieve, what they're really trying to protect against, look at how best to unwind or revamp some of the problematic provisions in place, and also to figure out how to make this a more collaborative exercise with other economies, with partners, again, to achieve a more consistent approach and a more united front. So, I'll close by just stating the obvious, which is that, this is a cerebral, methodical, collaborative, approach to China policy. It sounds great. No plan survives first contact with reality. The world intrudes. It's got a way of hitting us with challenges, whether we're ready or not. But all that said, I don't know about you, but by the end of the last 4 years, I was kind of tired of winning, shall we say. So I'm more than ready to see how this approach plays out.